Welcome to everyone who is listening to the class. This class will be an examination of a particular verse in the Parshas Vayetze. So I'll give you a little bit of context. Vayetze is about the journey that Yaakov is taking back from Laban. Previous weeks we hear about how Yaakov has been with his uncle Laban. He's sired a family. He's coming back to Israel. He is apprehensive that he's now coming back as a man with much property and assets, gold, silver, jewels, cow. The verse actually says, animals, flock, shepherd, servants, maidservants. He's a man of considerable means. He's got a family. He's got 4 wives. He's got 11 children. He's coming back with his entourage. But the reason why he left his home was because he had been given the blessings by his father, and his older brother was jealous, and that he was scared. That is, Jacob is scared that Esau, his brother, on his return, is going to take some sort of revenge. So, at the beginning of this week, the Parsha Vayetze, he's thinking about how he can bring back his return. He comes up with the idea that he's going to primarily he's asking God to help him. He prays. He's diplomatic, so he sends off presents to his brother, and he's prepared for the worst. So he's prepared to fight. And when he actually meets up with his brother is awed by all the things, how he's prepared, the blessings of Hashem, and his prayer is rewarded in that, and Esau is awakened his good feelings towards his brother, and they kiss, and they're happily united together, at least for a while. And then Jacob continues on his way. He's on his way back to his parents, the very aged, elderly parents, Isaac and Rivka, and he stops off in the city of Shechem till he can get back to his parents. Prior to his meeting with Esau on the night before, the verse tells us that he met up with a man as he was crossing the river of Yabok. It's hinted to, and it seems, and as Rashi tells us, that this is not just an ordinary man. This is an angel representing a proxy for Esau, and he meets a spiritual entity that's in the form of a man. They wrestled the night, and in the morning, that angel has dislocated his hip bone slightly. Jacob is limping, so he's physically hurt. When he meets Esau, Rashi makes a comment that he's annoyed that he has to go to these lengths, that he has to give him parts of his wealth in order to appease Esau. And notwithstanding that, after the end of the meeting, we find out that, yes, Esau is appeased. He takes the presents that he's been given, the and the text tells us the precise amount of presents from the flock that he's given him, and he's given him sheep, goats, etc. And Yaakov is somewhat annoyed that he had to part with some of this wealth. He's annoyed that he had to fight this man, which was spiritual representation of Esau, and he's come out that he's physically hurt, he's limping, but notwithstanding of that, after that meeting, as we just mentioned, he's moving, and the family is moving, and they've stayed off in the city of Sukkot till they will come to the place to Shechem, where they're going to stay. So the verse that we're going to examine, which is in our parsha, chapter 33, pasuk 18, right? It says that after all of that, which we just said, the context, it says, V'yova Yaakov Shalom. Yaakov returns safely to the city of Shechem. So it uses the word Shalom, and really, really the word, for instance, in Jerusalem is actually, we know that it means the city of peace, or you can translate it as complete, or Shalom you can translate as safety. It's essentially got the same connotation. When a person is feeling safe, he feels complete, he feels whole. So you can translate that as Jacob arrives, as many texts translate it as safely, or you can translate it as complete. Now, interestingly, Rashi, as the interpreter commentary, doesn't translate it as safely, but it translates it as complete. And that's a very valid translation. You'll find that translation mostly used. So Rashi's comment on that is that, what does it mean he arrived in a shalom way, and a complete way, a safe way, that those things which he had to we had to give up, was now in some respects complete. So we'll see what Rashi says is that he says that he is complete, he's not missing anything. So going back to the verse 18, it says V'yova Yaakov Shleim, he came back to where his objective was to come. That is, he came to Ir Shechem. He came to the city of Shechem, and there, which Shechem is part of Be'eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, because he's come from Padam Aram, which is where Laban lived, and he's now V'yechanes Pnei Ha'ir, and he's settled basically in the outskirts of the city of Shechem, and he's settling there for the moment. The next verses tell us how he pitches his tent, and he's making himself that this is going to place, he's going to purchase some land, etc. So let's going back to that he's arrived complete. So Rashi says, Shalom Begufe, he's come back and he's complete in his body, meaning that although when he first met Esau, and he was preparing them, and the night before he actually met Esau, when he was traveling over the Yabok River, he had met that man. And we just discussed previously, this was the spiritual representation of Esau, who was coming to fight him, and he succeeded in coming away complete meaning still alive, but he was wounded to some extent. So now that he's arrived in Shechem, he's now become healed from whatever physical negative circumstances that he had. And Rashi then continues and says, in fact, he's also come, not just his health is totally revived, but his shalom b'memena, he's complete with his money, his assets, meaning to say, shaloi chasa klum, and Rashi continues, he's not missing out. He hasn't felt the loss, even though initially he was, Rashi had pointed out, and we mentioned previously, he was annoyed that he had to give him some of his assets, he had to give him some of his wealth, right? But now, in this interim period of time, his flocks have increased, his flocks have expanded, and so therefore he hasn't Doran. He hasn't lost anything out by giving Esau that present. And further, it says Shaloi Chosa Klum, Shaloi and his Shalom B'Tei Rasam. He's also complete in his Torah study. That is to say, Shaloi Shokach. He hasn't forgotten. He hasn't forgotten any of the Torah that he had learned. That is to say, that because of the turmoil that he went through with Esau, and even before the turmoil that he's gone through the 20 years being in Laban's house, he hasn't forgotten any of his studies. Rashi says, Shokach Talmidei, but based Laban, he hasn't forgotten any of his learnings because he had worked so hard and travailed in the house of Laban. He had progressed and at least not forgotten anything. So fantastic, and so he's now in the city of Shechem, and he's now Shalom. He's now complete. But there's some questions that we need to ask and we need to examine a little bit more carefully. And what are they? Okay. So when he arrives, we've just said Rashi's Pirush, right? And we know that within the Talmud, in the Gemara Shabbos 33b over there, it actually mentions this idea, and it tells us how this idea about Yaakov coming back and he's complete. Interestingly, in another source of ours, that in the Medrash, it actually mentions those three things, exactly what we just said, but it also mentions another aspect, and that was what it is that it says, and his family is complete. He hasn't lost anyone from his family, right? And part of the initial meeting, which we didn't discuss before, but we saw that Esau was scared that there might be some sort of physical, physical fighting, and someone might get injured. Therefore, he split his camp into two, so that if there was a fight, if there had to be some sort of effort, then the family would survive by placing them in two separate. In his strategy that he was going to split them into two, and one could run away, etc. But this didn't happen at all, right? And the family is complete. So that's the Medrash's comment. So interestingly, we say to ourselves, we ask a question: why didn't Rashi mention this fourth object, this fourth idea? And what's the deeper meaning behind behind all of this. And so continuing and the thought, right, we we have these questions. If Rashi wants to teach us the most simplest understanding of the verse, why did Rashi actually have to bring the comment at all? Why did he these three issues, or maybe four issues, as the Talmud writes or the Medrash writes, that he's come shalom? Why don't we just say that he's had a very tumultuous um, a life over with, in the 20 years in Laban. He's coming past his brother, who his brother swore that he wanted to kill him in the end of in the previous, as we learned from the previous verse, and he's now past this threat of his brother. So he's now he's now safely ensconced back in the land of Israel. Why didn't Rashi just tell us, that simply? Why does he need to tell us this a little bit more complex idea of that he's now complete in these three or four things, as the Talmud and the Medrash and the Medrash comment? So that's one. That's one sort of question that we can ask. But so that what convinced Rashi that he needs to add, or what does Rashi want to inform us, that these especially wants to inform us these ideas that he's complete in this fullest sense. And in fact, we want to, since the source of Rashi is either the Gemara or the Medrash, why did Rashi miss out on that fourth aspect about the family coming as a whole? So one opinion is that one of the commentators say is the opinion that that really there was a possibility that while he's on the road, Esau might change his mind. There's this possibility that Esau might change his mind about his love for his brother after accepting the presents. He might just turn around and still attack him. So the possibility starts that, and Rashi makes the comment that no, really, he can now feel secure. He's back in the land of his forefathers. He's now in Shechem. He's now ensconced in Shechem. Being that he's now back there, he doesn't fear for his safety. So now, previously, he was in fear of his safety, potentially, right? But therefore, all of those things were still, all those four above mentioned things, three or four, were still a possibility. But now that he's settled in Shechem, and the verse tells us that he's now complete, right? So Rashi says, well, what does that mean? He's complete. He sees a fulfillment of one of God's promises. So let's go back and remember that in the text of the previous week's portion, when God appeared to Jacob and he told him that there's now time for you to return back to Israel. He told him that now's the time to leave, right? And he was told over in the previous parsha in Pasuk 15, in verse 15, Hashem gives him when he appeared to him and he had the dream of Jacob, of the ladder and the angels. At that point, he had a dream he saw Hashem, and Hashem said to him, or Hashem spoke to him and told him, I'm going to be with you. And now, and he says, "V'shamati," and I'm going to protect you, b'chol asher telechu, in your journeys. So now he's settled in Shechem. Now he sees a fulfillment of God's promise, and then with that fulfillment of God's promise, he now feels content. So in that respect, he feels everything's in place. But however, Rashi feels that since that Hashem has already guaranteed um, that he will be safe, so that reason of the idea that of the safety now that he's here has now been fulfilled. We, being students of the Torah, know that Hashem had given this guarantee. So now that the verse has told us that he's come shalom, he's come complete, and we see that fulfillment, we think to ourselves that word shalom, that he's now arrived and he's now safely in Shechem. He feels complete in Shechem. That word is actually quite redundant because, after all, he had the guarantee, he had Hashem's guarantee. So, in order to understand what this extra word is trying to imply to us, Rashi goes out and finds an explanation according to the Talmud that he feels content. Now, Rashi could have thought as follows. That to say, well, the promise that he was given in the previous parsha, which we said at the time of Jacob's ladder, was that Hashem said, "Ushma tich, I'm going to guard you." Well, guarding is doesn't necessarily mean that he will come back complete. It just means that you'll be protected from safely. It doesn't necessarily mean that your wealth will be protected. It doesn't mean that your family necessarily will be fully protected, and nor does it mean that you'll be spiritually protected to the extent that you will not, you won't forget any of your Torah. So therefore, Rashi feels forced to say that the interpretation of this word shalom here is to emphasize that when Hashem made that promise initially, that when he was to leave, that he's fulfilled it in its complete sense, in that he's now totally whole. That Yaakov, when he's come back, he's now whole in these three different aspects. That he's now whole in the idea of financial security, of family security, and his spiritual security in relationship to into that, and to his physical sin, in that he's no longer limping, is no longer physically constrained by what's happened. So so that's our this is our understanding based on those ideas of the idea of shalom, and that therefore is now complete. And the reason why Rashi didn't have to write that fourth thing, why he adopted the expression of the Gemara of the Talmud rather than the fourth thing of the family, and the reason why, as we just mentioned, that the version of the Talmud of three things as opposed to the fourth, which is what the emphasis was on, that the family would be complete, is something which is reasonably obvious, because after all, those blessings which Jacob received at the onset of the previous parsha, which was verses 14 and 15, he promised him, Hashem, part of his promise. He said that translated, your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and you will spread out all the land. That's verse 4. That's verse 28, 14, and then the verse of the explicit promise of 15 is that I will protect you and guard you wherever you are. So that surely should include the family. So therefore, since we're saying that that blessing was totally fulfilled, it wasn't necessary for Rashi to actually to write that. So we have a very interesting and beautiful explanation of the verse. Now, but I'd like to delve into that a little bit further. When this teaching was first discussed by the Rebbe at a particular time when he taught us this, the Rebbe expanded on that and gave a very beautiful spiritual explanation to all these things, and and the teaching being that when Jacob arrived, as we said, he came b'sholem, complete. One of the basic teachings, and I think we've said this once before, that the whole idea of Jacob going and leaving his father's house and going to Laban, going to his uncle, and his whole story of working with his uncle. His uncle wasn't such a wasn't such a good person. He was somewhat trickery. He was a man full of trickery, and he tricked him from conniving and tricked him from beginning to end of while he was there. And his whole story, and this whole story of coming back, the travails with Jacob. In Chassidus, we have this all as a symbolism of the idea that this is somehow an analogy to the people of Israel's journey from their exile from Israel and their travails through what we understand to be the exile in general. And we see that this is that all those negativities which Jacob had through his travels and his problems is somehow analogous to his descendants' journey in the many periods of exile. And therefore we live with the promise that just as Jacob arrived complete with his body, with his finances, and with his connections to God via his Torah-knowledge intact, that the nation Israel and the people Israel will ultimately, in the fullness of time, will ultimately arrive to our Holy Land in a complete fashion in the Messianic age, but will be intact in all these three respects. So we mentioned that Yaakov is fully recovered in a physical sense. He's fully recovered from that limp that he had with that wrestling with that representative of Esau. In the Medrash, Jacob's hip injury is seen as representing the persecutions that Jacob's descendants would eventually suffer during the exile and in all the periods of time. Yet we live with the promise that the end of that exile, that they will arrive intact to the Holy Land. But And this dislocation of the hip, this idea that there's been physical um, uh, and physical um, problems in the physical realm. This only marks the struggle in exile, but this will lead to an enhanced spiritual fitness, an even deeper bond with God, stimulated. Um, the Jewish people will be stimulated through all that persecution to have a deeper and stronger connection, but that we won't lose anything out of it. That people will, come back and will be protected. When we talked about the other aspect, his finances, he had an extensive asset, and he was worried about this depleted by his gift to Esau. But notwithstanding that, by the time he set in Shem, that replenished themselves. So Jacob's investment of gifts to Esau for the purposes of transforming Esau's feeling towards him foreshadowed that the idea that we invest in the physical realm um, um, in order to gain physical possessions, but we have an intent in that we utilize our physical resources to sanctify ourselves through holy living, and we sanctify those physical objects that we've accumulated by using them for holy purposes. So therefore, it's not that there are investments for the sake of themselves, but these investments are actually for the intent that we make them holy by being involved in the mundane world, but transforming those mundane aspects to utilize them for holy purposes, for Jewish education, for helping our fellow man, for teaching the world about spirituality, and therefore they become elevated and subsumed in the realm of holiness, and they become a return in the investment of not the physical sense, but the spiritual sense that we've invested into the physical world by drawing them into a realm of holiness. And that third aspect of that we said Jacob did not forget any of the Torah that he learned. So this is a whole different realm of elevation, in a bridge between the two aspects, between the finance and physical health, investing oneself, but having spiritual growth, because even though that the two aspects, that is, his physical health, but there was a depletion, and in his assets there was a depletion, but this was only a temporary loss, as we just learned. However, what's interesting to note is that we don't say that there was a similar thing with Jacob when he was there, even though he was within the travails of working for Laban, and had little sleep while he was a good employee and helping his flock, etc. But Jacob never experienced any loss in regard to his Torah knowledge, even temporarily. So similarly, we can say that, and we understand that although our bodies and resources may have gone under some temporary loss during the exile, but this is later that is later replenished. But that's not so with our Torah knowledge, as we can see that our Torah knowledge over the generations has only increased, and from anybody who's seen a Jewish library will understand that our Torah knowledge has increased, has not lost anything with the exile, but has actually expanded and increased, and our spiritual core has never been compromised, even in even during the worst of the exiles and the worst of our pain, and has only increased and has gained through the much, even though they've been through pain and turmoil, but that pain and turmoil of those years have enhanced our knowledge, enhanced our wisdom, so that we eventually will return to the Holy Land, but with even a stronger connection and understanding of godliness. So that is the interpretation of the word shalom, of complete. And so I think that's a very beautiful explanation of the verses, and we can think about how that applies in our own daily lives. Okay, wishing everybody a great week. Okay.